For thousands of years, civilization has been a destructive force, both ecologically and socially. In the midst of the sixth extinction, the future of humanity and our other than human kin hangs by a thread. At this pivotal moment in time, we must reach back into the depths of the human story and uncover our mistakes. There's still time to reconnect to what we have lost, to restore our broken relationship to the land where we dwell, and to remember the human place in the wild. Hello, and welcome to the Rewilding Podcast. I'm your host, Peter Michael Bauer. This podcast is produced and made possible from supporters on Patreon. Thank you. If the Rewilding Podcast inspires you, gives you hope, or makes you think, please subscribe, share it on social media, and become a patron at patreon.com/Peter Michael Bauer. Anthropology is at the core of rewilding. Understanding the various ways in which humans act and why helps us draw a picture of what is possible for humanity. Rewilding pulls its inspiration from the millions of years that humans lived in relative harmony with our environments, without causing the sixth mass extinction and without creating large-scale inequality, and how these crises came about. To make cultural transformations, we have to understand where material determinism and intentional idealism come together. On this episode of the Rewilding Podcast, I've invited Daniel, the host of What is Politics YouTube channel, to explain how this all works. What is Politics is a compelling series that delves into the natural histories and anthropology of politics in the form of didactic storytelling. I came across Daniel's long-form videos on YouTube last year when I was complaining about how off the mark David Graeber's book, The Dawn of Everything is, how much it omits, how much it ignores, how much it simply pretends doesn't already exist on the subject. And someone sent me a link to the What is Politics critiques. People had been asking me to write a review, and I couldn't get past the first 100 pages of what I considered a misdirection. The amount of time it would have taken to review the book felt daunting, and I kept putting it off. I was super relieved to find and watch the What is Politics reviews to see that someone had gone through the trouble of going through the book with a fine tooth and comb and so much deeper than I ever could have. Now, when people ask me what my thoughts on the dawn of everything are, I just send them to the What is Politics YouTube channel. It's a huge relief, to be honest. For these reasons and more, I'm excited to have Daniel as a guest on the Rewilding Podcast to talk about the material realities that give rise to and or provide the fuel for certain human, political, and social organizations. Daniel, thanks for coming on the Rewilding Podcast.
Yay, thanks for having me on. It's nice to meet you. And you are very lucky that you didn't do that review because I did 3 chapters of the book so far. It took me 9 months almost straight of work to do.
Yeah.
And
thank you.
Consider yourself bullet
Thank
dodged.
you.
Yeah. Before you ask me anything, could I ask you, when you say you consider misdirection, you're upset about it, what was it that bothered you about the book?
I mean, first of all, there was just this sort of like pretentious tone that that came across, and it felt like they were being like all this other stuff that's been written about this for the last like 100 years or whatever doesn't really make sense and doesn't matter. So we're just going to pretend like it doesn't exist and then tell you what, blah, 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 blah. And then like, page after page, it was just like Christopher Bohm said this thing, but he doesn't know what he's talking about. Or, all of this research into primates doesn't really matter because we're not chimpanzees or whatever. Just stuff like that. That was like, what are you talking about? Like, there's so much foundation that you could build off of. And it felt really weird because I do feel, and we can talk about this a lot more later because I've got questions around it. But I do feel like there was an important point in the book. And I feel like that point could have come together with the material determinism that we know of and been even more powerful. But instead, it just bashed material determinism to this point of like, none of that actually matters. It reminded me of the book. I don't know if you remember this, like 20 years ago, there was all this hype in the same kind of way about a book about spirituality called The Secret. Do you remember this? And the secret was just visualize what you want in the world and it will come to you. Oh my God. And this is, to me, like the dawn of everything is like The Secret, but for anthropology or something.
For politics. That's exactly right. Yeah. I never thought of it. I mean, I always make fun of The Secret and laugh about it, and I still make jokes about it. But holy crap, that's right. That's what that book is. Yeah. I compare it to smoking crack. Like, it gives you the confidence and all the hope, but none of the skills and tools.
Totally.
So, you smoke a crack pipe and you're like, whoa,
Yes.
I can do it. We can have equality. We can have revolution. But you didn't learn anything about how that could actually happen. So then you're just going to go do something insane and fail trying.
Exactly.
So that's,
Exactly.
So it served a good purpose. It had a good goal. And it also, I think, lights up people because it did something. This is what I have a lot of these problems with a lot of David Graeber's work, right? Because he's very exciting. Totally. He wasn't a very exciting anthropologist, had a lot of great ideas. But so he asked the questions that need to be asked, and in a way, and writes in a popular style, because so many academics do not know how to write. They're writing in gibberish. Like, we can talk about it later, but I feel like academia after the 60s and 70s, which I think posed a threat to authority, they found a way to turn academia into just a masturbation gibberish bubble where nobody's talking to the outside. They're only talking to themselves, and they're these neutralized. You take the best brains in the country, neutralize them, make them unintelligible, and make them full of gibberish. So he gets out of that bubble because he can speak in English. He writes an exciting, good book, but it's a complete failure. Like, it doesn't. It's just this mishmash of important ideas. He asked the questions that need to be asked. Why are we stuck in hierarchy? And what can we do about it? And then completely fails to answer the questions because his whole paradigm, it guarantees that he fails to ask that question.
Exactly.
He's so afraid to look at the material causes of hierarchy and inequality in the past. Thinks, and Wengrow too, let's not forget about him. They think that if you look at material conditions, then he thinks that there's agency or materialism. No, it's one exclusion of the other. Materialism, civilization. So let's just write a book where we just ignore, deny, and pretend materialism doesn't exist, and then we can just show how much freedom we have to do whatever we want. So, we are people who live in a civilization. We don't know how to participate in government and in society of us. So it's great to read a book and feel good about it. But if you actually want to do something that's going to motivate people to actually act and do something, this takes away the skills that you need to act and do something. So, because if you want to, for example, build an airplane, it's very exciting to tell people, you can fly. All you have to do is just, if you really want to fly, you can fly.
Right.
And that's sort of true, but you still need to build an airplane or else you can't fly. And that's depressing because it might be difficult to build an airplane and it's hard. Where do I get the metals? How do I get the knowledge? Well, it might take you 200 years because you don't have the materials, and that's just a fact, but work on it. Or if you at least know the principles of aerodynamics, maybe you could build some kind of kite, maybe you could do something else.
Totally.
But you have to know the principles of how things work. And that book not only doesn't talk about those things, but actively hides them and ignores them, right? They talk about, some egalitarian societies that existed, and then they'll report parts of the book and they just ignore every part of the book that explains why that society was that way, and then insult the author and say, he's so stupid.
I know. I was ranting about it on Facebook and stuff, and people were like, we don't understand why you're so angry about this. Why, I like the book. I don't understand why you're upset. And I'm just like, you can't tell that this is insulting to me and all these other people, these authors that I have a lot of respect for. But in terms of how you're talking about this academic language, right? Kind of confusing things. Is this why you created the What is Politics YouTube channel to, what was it, the inspiration behind creating the What is Politics channel?
So actually it's the other way around. I was dealing with non-academic people, and I was dealing with family members who are like, damn, I'm in Canada, the healthcare system is really messed up. And the reason it's messed up, not that people know, is that, we used to have, it was always judged as one of the top 3 healthcare systems in the world. Like when I was a kid, you'd see that advertised on TV. The government would make these ads we have the number 3 healthcare system in the world. But find Finland and Japan, it would always be jockeying in those top 3 positions. Then in 1994, the government just slashed everything and gutted it and never put the money back in, put some money back in, but not enough. And they've been bleeding it to death on purpose, basically, ever since. And I see all these people who are just I wish we had a better public healthcare. We need to put more money in the system. That's why I'm voting for the Conservative Party, which is the party that wants to slash the healthcare even faster than the Liberal Party. It's like voting for the Republican. It's like voting for Donald Trump if you want universal healthcare, right? It's exactly like that. And I'm just oh my God. And I live in a province in Quebec where the dividing lines the way people vote is just based on, are you a nationalist, or are like Quebec nationalism? We have like people who want Quebec separation, or are you a federalist? Like, I want to remain part of Canada. So people vote just based on that, and they're not like left and right barely doesn't exist. You have 4 right-wing parties in Quebec and 1 left-wing party, and people have single mothers on welfare voting for the party that cut subsidies to daycares because we have these subsidized daycares. Anyways, so I was just like fed up with all this nonsense, and I'm like, let's just explain to people what left and right means and why it's important, when you're going to go vote. That was my first, first thing I was trying to do. And then as I sat down to like define left and right, I was like, hey, you know what? I don't really think I know what left and right mean. Let's look it up in a dictionary. Let's look it up in an encyclopedia. Let's look it up in a book. And I kept getting more and more books and academic books and articles and popular books. And I was like, nobody knows what these things mean. So I ended up having to do a giant research project to kind of like tease out what it historically meant. Oh, and I see that the meaning changed over time, and it turned into gibberish basically around the Cold War and afterwards. And now it means almost nothing. It means it's become a PR tool. And anyways, we can talk about that too. There's certain psychological traits that people have. And today I think that left wing just is a PR tool to reach the certain kind of people who are open to experience, who have that trait. And then the right wing is people who are closed to experience. But 100 years ago, someone who's a communist would be somebody today who votes for the Republicans. There wasn't it was more based on actual interests, perceived. I mean, people always vote based on perceived self-interest, but the PR industry has sort of like figured out who we are and then just pumped, like it's like breaking us down into demographics. Like, this is the kind of person who's going to buy this kind of music. So let's just pump them with this. So they found that there's this dividing line among people. And I could talk about the evolutionary reasons that might have that about 50% of the population goes this way and 50% of the population has these characteristics. And they've just turned and that's why you see like every election is like a 50%, especially in the States, you really see it where you just have 2 parties. The elections are just like, how could it be that people are just so evenly divided between these parties, which, I mean, they have a lot in common, but a lot not in common? I think it's just this marketing genius that unintentionally did this.
If you could talk a little bit about that, because it makes me think about like fascism being on the rise. I'm like, is 50% of the population really like into fascism? But I don't think that's true, right? Because I feel like later on we're going to talk a little bit more about like, the potential innateness of egalitarian societies. You know what I mean? So there's this conflict in my mind, right? So it would be awesome if you could talk a little bit about that.
And it's cool. This is the exclusive. Like, I haven't even done this on my show yet. So you're getting the exclusive first. And which also means I haven't sat down and done the deep reading on this, but I'm putting it together from a bunch. Cool. So it'll be a bit half-baked.
Awesome.
But if you want me to start on that right now.
Just a little, if you could condense it.
In the Paleolithic, right? Which is human beings emerged probably about 300,000 years ago. We don't have a lot of evidence, but you start to get more and more evidence around 200,000 years ago. And it seems like we probably emerged as an egalitarian species, more or less. Certainly much more egalitarian than most of what we see now. But in the Paleolithic, the temperatures were fluctuating very rapidly. So climatic change was very exaggerated compared to how it's been for the last 12,000 years. Okay, so every generation or two, you'd have actually serious changes of climate where, this area used to be a great, beautiful pasture. Now it's a barren area, or this is too cold now to hunt the animals that we hunt. So probably people were going through these cycles of being squeezed for resources and then relaxed and open, and there's more expansion for resources. So we have these 2 modes of social organization, and I think that comes with it a bunch of character traits, cultural traits, where in times of more scarcity and competition for resources, people become a bit more what we call tribal, hierarchical, violent, xenophobic, things like that. And then in times of, and probably more male dominated as well. And then in times of more resource availability and expansion times, people become much more peaceful, much more egalitarian. Gender equality becomes very important, and stuff like that. And also have much wider social networks. The social networks close down and get smaller in those squeeze periods. I think that explains why we're so good at equality. People don't realize that we are so good at equality because they haven't seen anything, but we'll talk about immediate return hunter-gatherers and see that we actually are very good at equality, which nobody knows. That's why I was so pissed off about this David Graeber book.
They don't even mention the word immediate return hunter-gatherers in their whole book, you know?
No, like David Graeber, it turns out, hated that whole idea. What's his name? Chris Knight, who is a really cool anthropologist and who really focuses on that stuff and is very explicitly political. He was giving an interview and he talked about how one of his mutual friends, because he knew David Graeber as well, told him that, oh yeah, Graeber hates that stuff. He doesn't believe in any of it. He thinks it's all fake news. Like all those, there's about like 60 years now of literature on these hyper egalitarian societies who live like the anarcho-communist dream and have gender equality. There's no leaders. There's no shamans controlling anybody. They have everything that we would want in a society. I mean, except for, advanced medicine and like flying cars, they have base more or less. And he just didn't believe any of it. He thought that all that stuff was crap. And I kind of was getting that sense anyways, just reading his stuff and wondering why he just never, like when I was a kid, and discovering David Graeber, I was like, wow, anarchist anthropologist. I can't wait to see what he has to say about all these egalitarian societies. And I'm like reading all his books and like, it's not in there anywhere.
Yeah.
And I'm just like, does he just not know about this stuff? That's weird. And that could be because in academia, people are siloed and often don't know outside their tiny little specialty. And then I would see whenever he talked about egalitarianism, he would always, it would be like a fake, he would talk about like some male-dominated society. I'm like, that's not an egalitarian society. Yeah. It would have been considered egalitarian in the 50s before we discovered that there were gender equal societies. I mean, although we kind of knew that in the 1850s as well with the Haudenosaunee and people like that. But anyways, I got lost my whole train of thought. So we are very good at egalitarianism, and there's lots of reasons to believe that we began as an egalitarian species. And we might have been mostly egalitarian throughout all the Paleolithic as well. It's hard to tell. Certainly by the end of the Paleolithic, we see more and more evidence of some potential hierarchy emerging. But my two theories about why we are so good at hierarchy and equality are this like squeeze expansion theory of the Paleolithic. And that's true. That's how the climate was. That's why there was no agriculture, by the way, until 12,000 years ago, because the climate was changing too fast for agriculture to ever be viable. So they found a few experiments with agriculture like 30,000 years ago, 23,000 years ago, but people give it up after 20 years because then the climate just changes and you can't, there was too much room. It was too easy to hunt and gather and too hard to do agriculture. So there's just no point in really doing it over long term.
So do you think that Graham Hancock is right then, that there's an ancient... I'm just kidding.
I don't know who that is.
So. Oh, okay, good. No.
I don't know if I should be proud of not knowing who that is.
Let's not go down that rabbit hole. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, no, let's just...
So the two theories
that.
Are the squeeze expansion theory of the Paleolithic, or before we were egalitarian hunter-gatherers, we were probably hierarchical apes, and we're sort of like halfway in transition before the Holocene happened, and then our hierarchical part of our nature just never completely evolved out. So now we have this, we can float around. Although most great apes, you can see that when they're in different circumstances, actually organize a little bit differently as well. There's some baboon studies that Sapolsky pointed out that there was a troop of baboons, and most people think of animals and great apes as just entirely genetically programmed and that their social structure is entirely genetic, probably a bit more than ours. But at the same time, so baboons are very male dominated, and that has a lot to do with men being twice as big as women. So it's very easy to dominate, and they're very hierarchical as well. And then so what that means, the hierarchy in great apes means that you get access to food first and sex also. So there was a botulism, I think, infected garbage with a bunch of botulism meat or bananas, or I forget what. And the alphas ate all the stuff first, and then they all died off. So you only had these betas and gammas, or not even like gammas, deltas, like the lower ranking bebas were the only ones left. And they just had a much more egalitarian society. And even when potential alphas came in from outside, they enculturated them into their more, it wasn't completely egalitarian, but it was much more egalitarian than other baboons. And then that was in 1986. And 30 years, or how many years later now we are, 40 years later, it's still that way now. So animal, the nature of animals is not as fixed as we often think it is.
This is like a good, so this is what I want to like have you kind of explain the the difference between material determinism and idealism, or the ability to change something based on like culture.
So like, I'm not the first person to say this, but they're not really distinguishable. They're one and the same thing. And for me, materialism is just, so like in their pure fake dichotomous form, materialism is the environment, nature causes everything. Every idea that we have comes from the outside. Like, the classic one I always use is Marx said that capitalism generates the Protestant work ethic. But Weber would say, no, the Protestant work ethic is what made capitalism possible, right? And so that's the idealistic view is Weber. People had these ideas, and the ideas, like people in Saudi Arabia are so male dominated because they're just bad meanie-weenies and they're just sexist. That's in a very idealistic way of thinking. Oh, in America, we love freedom. That's why we had the Constitution, which whatever.
Sure.
in theory is supposed to have all this freedom in it, right? So, and then the materialist reason is no, in Saudi Arabia, they're male dominated because their form of social organization when they were Bedouin pastoralists is such that men had all these advantages because of the various conditions that they were living in, which we can talk about later. And then that spilled over into modern times. It's the practical conditions of shape. Now, both of those things are true. We have agency. We're not just robot, but we live in a serialism is just looking at things in their context. And I don't talk so much about material conditions because it has a weird Marxist connotation, but it also makes people think about just the environment. But no, it's the practical conditions. And part of the practical conditions are pre-existing culture. So if you're living in a situation where everybody has really male-dominated ideas, well, that's a material reality, and that people are going to go out and beat up a woman who wears a miniskirt. Like that's a reality that you have to live with. It's cultural, but it's also a physical reality. They're not that different because our cultures and our minds are physical objects as well. So, but in the long term, I think that it's much more useful to look at material context. And in the short term, it's also useful, but there's more room for ideas to play out. And what I mean is, let's say you have 10 people and there's no material reason why anyone should have any advantage over anyone else. We all are, we have equal wealth. We all, I don't know. It's not like I have an army or I have guns and I can control everybody. I have no advantage over anybody else, but I'm really charismatic and I managed for some reason to make everyone follow me around and just make me their leader and their king. I terrorize them. I make up a bunch of stories. That can work for a few years, maybe for a generation, but 10 generations, someone's going to eventually figure, one of my kids might be stupid and not be able to continue this thing. And someone's going to figure out, wait, why are we following this guy? We don't have to do this. And it's not going to be stable. It's not going to last that long. So when you see something lasting 10,000 years, there's usually a material context. There's a reason for it. It's not just, oh, these people were all sexist and that's why these people were all male dominated for the last 5,000 years. No, something happened that made that happen, or these people are not male dominated. Why is that? Oh, not that just they're such great feminist males and women were so much smarter there and our women are so much weaker. And that's the problem with the David Graeber type of thesis, is it sort of implies like, oh, the Saudi Arabians are just such bad meanie-weenies. Oh, the Hads of foragers are just such great people and their women are so much more stronger and powerful and the women in Saudi Arabia are such wimps. Mm-hmm. But that's where that leads, where it's just ideas that shape society and not context, eventually just makes everybody's fault.
Yeah. It's the secret, right?
So the secret is a great manifest exactly. You didn't manifest it hard enough. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it's your fault at the end of the day. I mean, the author of The Secret didn't mean to say everything's your fault. And the people that give it don't mean to say, oh, thinking takes you, right? Whereas the materialist thinking is there, but for the grace of God go I. Oh, if I was raised in Saudi Arabia and I was in those conditions and I'm a woman, I would be stuck and forced, I would have much different options than a woman in Denmark does. And I might revel in my own oppression like that a woman might revel in there too. Or I might not want to choose to rebel because I'm going to get killed, etc.
Yeah. Awesome. Yeah. Yeah, cool. Yeah, your internet still kind of was fluctuating a little bit there, but I think we got everything.
Oh, sorry. Okay, yeah.
If you see me just turn my video off, it's just I'm trying
If
to.
if I get more Patreon subscribers, I can get a faster internet.
Yeah, nice. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I guess we're circling all of the questions that I have for you, and one of them is, what do you think the dawn of everything was trying to accomplish, and is there a better way to get there?
Yes. Okay. So there's definitely a better way to get there. So I applaud the authors for asking the right questions, for bringing to our attention all this anthropology, which is where the answers to those questions lie. But I fault the authors for blowing it big time in just refusing to look at the answers, and then for faking stuff almost, and it's, insulting everyone, insulting the answers. What they were trying to accomplish was they wanted to give us hope that an egalitarian future is possible. They were looking at authors who say or imply that real egalitarianism is not possible because civilization just demands a high level of hierarchy. And they're trying to push back against that. And those arguments will say, well, the practical realities of civilization, there's just so many people, society is very a specialized labor that you can't possibly have a sort of decentralized society in those conditions. Maybe I should turn off my video. So they're trying to argue against that material determinist arguments. And like I mentioned earlier, I think David Graeber really had it in his head that if you accept that cultures like hierarchy or inequality is in large extent a function of material conditions, then you have no hope. Then we are in fact trapped in these very unequal, unfair arrangements because of the nature of civilization itself. So what they did is they went through all of this anthropology of all these different types of societies, changing back and forth, for example, or living in different arrangements, like in civilizations or in hunter-gatherer societies and all kinds of other societies. And they make it sound like these people just chose their different social arrangements. And that in fact, their thesis was like, one of the questions they ask is, in the past, we used to just switch back and forth between hierarchy, equality for fun and kicks. I forget how they phrase it, but they basically say for fun and ritual and play, like it was just some kind of big joke, which sounds like it makes sense if you know absolutely nothing about societies. Like if you're watching cartoons and you see all these cave, that's how they're often shown in a lot of TV shows. People are like ooga booga, and they're doing these weird freaky rituals, and they're lighting fires and praying to gods, and it just seems like a bunch of fun, like it's Burning Man or just some nonsense. But hierarchy isn't just a cool game. Hierarchy is your husband, if you're a woman, tells you what to do and you can't say no, and if you say no, he's allowed to hit you like that. You like, that's hierarchy. If nobody wants, some people might want direction, they might like having somebody tell them what to do every day in general, but they want the right to say no, I don't actually agree with that, and say not obey when they don't want to obey. So that book doesn't even allow that idea to exist, right? Like, and it's an insult to all the people that are, in those, they talk about the Inuit. It's the idea that Inuit go back and forth. They talk about Inuit had patriarchy in the summer, but then not in the winter. So, it's all a big game. Well, no. Why would women accept to be beat by their husbands in the summer, but not in the winter? That doesn't make any sense. Obviously, they didn't want to get beat any time of the year, but there was something that actually allowed them not to be beat in the winter, which wasn't there, or that's something that gave men an advantage that they didn't have in the summer. And that whole concept of advantage and bargaining power is absent in the book. And in a way, it's not their fault, because these are ideas that just aren't, if you go to political science in academia and you study anthropology, there's very little discussion of bargaining power and that stuff. It's really not there. Like I think about it a lot because I'm a lawyer actually, and I do a lot of negotiations. So, I mean, I was thinking about those things anyways, but especially doing this, I really see that everything is just about, bargaining power. If you look at a society, why does Denmark have greater labor laws than the United States? Well, because the labor movement had more bargaining power, and they fought harder. They were able to fight harder and win more rights. The constitutions of different states and the laws of different states reflect the relative bargaining power of the different parties in those societies. Why did women have the right to vote? Why did they all get the right to vote in most countries around World War I? It's because women had more bargaining power, because all of a sudden they were the workforce, and society depended on them completely for not just home work, but work outside the home. So they got all this leverage. After wars, common people tend to get a lot more rights, and you'll see that throughout European history. After every war, suddenly men didn't have the right. Then there's the wars, and suddenly men have the right to vote. So everything is, if you want to understand politics, including political anthropology, you need to understand relative bargaining power. And so that book just erases that whole idea, doesn't bring it up, and also they bring up a lot of. Maybe I should skip to the answer of, can they do it better? Well, I want to, like, you talked about Christopher Boehm. Okay. So he writes this book called Hierarchy in the Forest. And in that book, he explains why he thinks that human beings were all mostly egalitarians. And until about 5,000 years ago, most human beings were living in a relatively egalitarian society. And he explains at length, the whole book is about why that is, but the authors of the book just say, well, Boehm is a great, smart thinker, because he says that it takes a lot of effort and willpower to maintain an egalitarian society. So he understood that these people were politically smart and that they maintained egalitarianism on purpose. So they give him kudos for that, because that seems like it's echoing their thesis. But why does he default to this stupid idea that people just chose the same form of social organization for 90% of human existence? That's nonsense. Like, he was just falling for that old canard, that old trope, and they don't mention that his entire book explains why he thinks what he thinks. It's not like they gave his reasons and they said, well, his reasons are wrong. They're saying, they're like, gee, why does he think this stupid thing? He must be a big dum-dum. And then I'm like, yeah, you've read the book. So when you read that, you were like flipping out and getting angry. But 99% of the people have not read this book. So they're just like, oh, that makes sense. What's wrong with that guy? What an idiot, And all the, because David Graeber equates the idea, and in that book, he says it explicitly, the idea of an egalitarian society where there's no oppression is infantile. It's not realistic. That's not human nature. And to believe that a society would be that way is to think of them as like Smurfs, basically. He doesn't say that in those words, but
sure,
you're basically just painting a fairy tale of Papa Smurf and the Smurfs all living in harmony, and it's not real. That's not who humans are. So I'm sure that when he was in college, he probably had them because at the time that this literature was coming out, it started in the late 50s and early 60s, and especially in the late 60s, he probably had a lot of very annoying hippie professors who were, ranting and raving about these immediate return societies and portraying them in very childish ways, because that's what college people, and this, I have a very chip on my shoulder against academia and upper middle class educated people, especially now I'm reading about the Russian Revolution. So people, these are elite type people, upper middle class people, and they kind of make everything stupid. So they're probably, making this very hippified, silly, utopian version of these immediate return hunter-gatherer societies. And then David Graeber probably was offended by this. And then he spent the rest of his life just thinking that all that stuff was crap. And he probably just never engaged with the literature at all until 2000, in between 2018, when he wrote an article where he was doing the same thing as always, just ignoring it. And then 2020, when the book came out, I think critics must have really yelled at him for it. And then he read a little bit about it. And then he talks about some of these societies in the book. So he does engage with some of those societies for the first time, because his entire career, he barely even mentions a single immediate return society. And there he actually talks about the Hadza at some length, at least. So I think he engaged, but he just, instead of learning anything from it, he just sort of squished it into his existing thesis. And it's very clumsy. And I think that's my theory for what he was doing. So he ignores all the, if anyone who studies those hyper-egalitarian societies has asked, why are they so egalitarian? And what's interesting about them is that they're living in completely different conditions all across the world. You had some in the Kalahari Desert, you have some in the Tanzanian savanna, you have some in the Central African rainforests, you have some in North America in the 1600s, which the Jesuits wrote about, you have some in the mountains of India. So these very different environments spanning continents, spanning hundreds of years, and they all just have very similar cultures in many ways. I mean, they have a lot of superficial differences, but they all have male-female egalitarianism or near egalitarianism. There's no fixed authority leaders. There's no people. There's no one's commanding anyone else. They have very loose religious beliefs, which is really interesting. They don't have this deep, religion, no religious hierarchy. Yeah. They have, anyways, I don't know. There's all kinds of stuff, a lot of freedom, a lot of equality, the anarcho-communist ideal, basically. Okay. Yeah. So the people who have written about this stuff have thought about and talked about why that was. And actually, Christopher Boehm talks about that in his book, which the Graeber and Wengrow completely ignore. And they cite material reasons for why these societies were equal, because of the way populations were distributed and the types of hunting that they did that was nomadic. Basically, anyone had access to the means of production. Anyone could get food without having to depend on anybody. Exactly. So because to get hierarchy, you need one person or group of people to be able to dominate resources that other people depend on to live well. So you can leverage your control of those resources for obedience, right? That's why if you have a job, you obey your boss all day. Even though there's 1,000 employees and one boss, the employees all obey the boss, not the other way around, because the boss is the one who controls access to the salary that everybody depends on, right? Henry Kissinger said, if you control the food, you control the people, right? If you control, if you're living in a company town where the company owns the land and owns the house and owns all the stores and owns the things, you can, work the people, to the ground. So in those societies, there's no practical way for anyone to dominate anyone else in any long-term fashion. And because everybody has equal access to lethal weapons, which means if somebody's really bullying you, you can kill them with a poison arrow. If you're a man or woman, a woman can poison somebody. Everyone has equal access to projectile weapons. So the biggest alpha male who might have gotten somewhere in an ape society would get killed off in a human society, right? And anyone can get food anywhere, so you don't really depend on anyone. It's better to live in a group. You'll get better food and more food, but for most of the year, you can probably go off on your own if you have to. And there's always somewhere for people to go. If you don't like your group of people, you can just emigrate to another group of people because everyone's always on the move and you have friends and relatives spread out across all these bands. So the practical conditions that these people live, and women are equal because they form organizations to defend their rights, but they also have male relatives around who will stop. If your husband is bullying you, well, your brother is probably going to be around who can beat your husband up, or you might have cousins around, or somebody
or you can poison him,
or you can poison him and kill him. Yes. So all that stuff together, right? So the means of domination just don't really exist. Right. Well, and that changes when you go into agriculture, when you go into different kinds of hunting and gathering, because that's an immediate return to a specific kind of hunting and gathering. Yeah. Conditions change, and then the ability to dominate people does arise. So when you ask, is there a better way that they could have done this book? Well, what they could have done is, instead of thinking materialism means prison and we're just completely determined by our environment, they could realize, well, one of the things that makes human beings special, in the book they say, well, what makes human beings special is we can choose our political system. No, it's not that easy. Right. You can't just choose a political system. Right. You have to build the political system, and the political system has to have the right incentives built within it that people will make the right decisions that you want. Because as like in the Russian Revolution, they had anyways, it's debatable, but the Bolsheviks seem to actually believe in a form of direct democracy and egalitarianism to a large extent, but they didn't put any of the checks and balances in place to make that happen, and all the incentives and having also to do with war and deprivation and things like that. But the incentives were massively towards corruption and having the party hog all power and establish a new hierarchy. So what Graeber should have done is to say, well, no, what makes us special is not that we can just magically invent our political systems, because you can make a political system, but no one's going to follow it. Right. Like enforcement is 9/10 of the law is real, right? Like there's all these, like I defend tenants from landlords. So, and it's the same thing with labor law and tenant law. A lot of labor law and tenant law is just fancy toilet paper, because in reality, I once had a judge say this to me. The judge said, well, that your landlord could, because somebody was suing his landlord for something. And it was like, well, your landlord can just make your life hell, if you keep suing them with this, which is true. But I'm like, hey, judge, do your job. Like, that's why we come to you, because you're right. Like, you're supposed to make the landlord's life hell if they try this stuff. Like, Jesus Christ. Anyways, but the point is that if the material conditions aren't there to make your political system enforceable, then it's nothing. It doesn't count. So what Graeber could have said is, instead of we have the freedom to choose our political system, he should have said, what makes humans unique is that we have the ability to reshape our environments. That's what makes, I mean, it's not unique because there are other animals too, but we can do this a bit more consciously and in a more planned out manner than others. So when you're inventing your political system of the future, what you want to do is study how material conditions affect things like hierarchy and equality, so that you can build that into your system and make sure that the incentives are there that will maintain equality. Even if everybody's a bunch of psychopaths and a bunch of assholes, that they're still all going to be equal, because to not be equal would damage their self-interest, right? And that's what you see in these hunter-gatherer societies. It's not that everybody's just an amazing, wonderful egalitarian. I mean, they do have egalitarianism in their ethos, but they also are selfish. Like when somebody, you know, there's what is it? One of the stories was the anthropologist saw that whipped out a tomato and offered a piece of the tomato to one of her friends, like from the hunter-gatherer society. And her friend looked around and saw 9 people. And so she cut up her tomato into 9 equal portions and gave one to everybody there, because she was in public. Because if she didn't do that, people would say that you're a stingy person and I'm not going to share with you and you're violating the rules of society. But a lot of some interesting studies have shown that people from those same societies, which are the most egalitarian societies on earth, when they're in private, they'll actually hoard stuff a little bit more than other people, and they'll share less than other people because they're kind of tired of sharing, because they have to share all day long. So they're just as selfish as we are. And because of the rules of so much sharing, they might be a little more selfish than some of us are. But because of the fact that anyone can demand anything from you at any time, and to not do something will mean that everyone will look at you askance and won't share with you when you need it. Just the incentives are such that people share all the time, no matter how selfish or not selfish they are. And if they don't, there are consequences for it. So what Graeber should have done was looked at all the way that material incentives work, and then try to find some principles there that would help us build an egalitarian society in a civilizational context.
Totally. Yes.
Yeah.
So what are those? See, that's the big problem, right? Like, what got us stuck here? It's like, well, we understand why we're stuck here, right? But like, but then I don't know, because so the way that I kind of look at it and the way I explain it to people in terms of like civilization is, you know, there's this there's a graph, or not a graph, it's like an infographic or whatever of like the 3 elements that make a fire, right? It's like a triangle with the flame in the middle, and then each side of the triangle is a different thing, right? The bottom is fuel, one of the sides is oxygen, and the third one is heat. And without those 3 things, you don't have a fire, right?
Right. Yes.
So then, you know, so I've been trying to, like, that's just a metaphor, right? It's not like you can't move it over exactly. But when I explain civilization to people as a specific kind of society, there's like, you know, surplus of food is like the fuel, right? Like a hoarding of food, essentially. But you can get that, like you've explained in a lot of your videos, like you can get that without being an agricultural society, right? Like the Northwest Coast had, you know, a very similar subsistence to agricultural because of the salmon storage and all of that, right? So you can have what is a civilization, you know, by dictionary definition, it's like, you know, a system of writing is part of the definition of a civilization, as well as a complex political organization, which is basically just hierarchy. It's like a smokescreen for a hierarchy, right?
It's built into the definition, which is the problem, right?
Exactly. So a civilization is like a hierarchical society, you know, that is sedentary with a food surplus that has a form of writing. So, you know, and those can happen geographically with different forms of subsistence, like here in the Northwest Coast. But the ones that what we would call like colonial civilizations, the one that expand and kill their neighbors and take over, those are like agricultural, right? In nature. And the word colonial comes from the Roman word colere, which meant to till the soil. So it's literally like forcing other people into your grain taxation regime. That's literally like what colonization means, right? And it's something that we've seen in multiple civilizations all over the world. It's definitely not unique to any particular civilization. It's like there are some that arise geographically, and then there are some that are like colonial civilizations that are the agricultural ones. But yeah, like what gets us stuck in that in that framework, if we, and I like to equate it as like a forest fire, like thinking of civilization as a forest fire, like there's a level of fuel that's built up, right? And it's on fire now. Right. How do we put out that fire in order to, do something different, right? And it's in terms of like diminishing returns, right? Like if you look at the book Collapse of Complex Societies by Joseph Tainter, he talks about like the civilizational curve of energy returns. And so transformation only really becomes super possible when that society starts to transition from the point of growth to a point of descent. Is that, I'll stop.
No, go. Well, I mean, this is something I'm going to ask you about rewilding, because I have my answer about that, but I want to know maybe what you think a little bit, because, I haven't done the deep dive episode on let's plot out the future society, because I don't necessarily think we can have too much of a, we're so far from it that we want to have a general idea and have the general principles that we want. And we want to have like a couple of steps planned out. But beyond that, I don't know that it's that useful. Though there are interesting, like Michael Albert has something that's interesting is Parikon. Yanis Varoufakis is working on something. Then you have something like Matt Brunig, which is working out a type of socialism that almost looks exactly like the society we have today with a few modifications. That's modest, but looks like it's more achievable as like a step, or maybe that's where the final step, who knows. But so when you're talking about rewilding, because I have a lot of people who are anarcho-primitivists who like to argue with me or contact me, and that it's just not possible to have an egalitarian society, or even a society, or even a future at all, because of climate catastrophe. With a civilization context, we have to go back to hunting and gathering. Rewilding sounds a bit like that, but not exactly. So tell me about it. I'm sure your audience knows all about it. I don't. I read a little bit about it when you first contacted me. So tell me about it, and I'll.
So it definitely emerges from anarcho-primitivism for sure. And I think that there are, on some level, I consider myself an anarcho-primitivist, but like you're saying, there's these people who message you and say it's not possible, hunting and gathering. For me, there's a whole deeper explanation of what wildness is, in terms of like a conversation with an ecosystem, or a conversation with, the people together collectively, and how our will is shared, as an individual, as a collective, and then in an environment.
So just an idea of sustainability, more or less, if you want to.
Yeah, but there's this question of like, what level of a society is sustainable. For me, I look at it I don't like that word. So I look at it as the relationship between disturbance and regeneration. So like when people say, living in harmony, what does that even mean? It means that there's a relationship where your disturbances that you create through existence, consuming things, is somehow matched with regeneration, the regeneration of the environment that you're in.
Right. And which you see in the hunter-gatherer societies who are very careful to. And it's funny, the mechanisms are really weird. Like sometimes they're very conscious mechanisms. They're like, oh, we got to stop killing this kind of animal because there's too many of them. But sometimes there are these weird religious things where it's like, oh, it's bad karma. It's not karma, but it's like they have, it's called Aquila, like among the Hadza, they have, it's bad Aquila to hunt this blue, I forget what it's called, the antelope, so we have to stop now. And it's just this weird, these things that catch on, which seem to be conservation methods, but they're not conscious. Although some of them are, sometimes it is conscious, and sometimes it isn't conscious. It's very interesting that the play, and one of the things about the Dawn of Everything that pissed me off is that it made everything about consciousness, when so much of culture is just about unconsciousness, about doing things, because if we were conscious, we wouldn't do the right thing.
Totally.
We would probably be doing a selfish thing, but if we're unconscious, if we're afraid of some, mystical punishment or bad luck, then we'll actually behave in a way that's in our own interest, but in our long-term interest. But anyhow, but does rewilding require return to hunter-gatherer society, or it's just the idea that we have to pay attention to that issue of being able to replenish what we use?
So I think, when we look at immediate return societies, there's a couple of things that come up, right? Like one of those things is that's to me, that's like the litmus test, that's like the example of how we evolved, like if we're looking, to use the terms from the Paleolithic nutrition studies, like the environment of evolutionary adaptation. Right. So if immediate return is our environment of evolutionary adaptation, that's something we should know about and understand in terms of like what makes us tick, what makes us, what can inspire us to build something else. Right.
1,000,000%. Yeah.
But then, there is this problem, right, where the environment of evolutionary adaptation had way less people and way more megafauna.
Yes,
So
right.
immediate
Yes.
return hunting and gathering worked great when there was megafauna to hunt. There isn't anymore.
So well, it's still immediate return hunting gathering still works without megafauna, but it's being those cultures are being wiped out basically by the day as we speak.
Totally. Yes.
But 100 years ago there was still no megafauna, but there were very prosperous but well stable and happy immediate return functioning societies that weren't being pushed to extinction the way they are today. But
absolutely,
at the same time, I don't know how accurate this number is, but the number that's normally given is to live in a nomadic immediate return hunting and gathering society, you need about 0.1 people per square kilometer or something like that. So you'd have to kill off, that's the argument against all the anarcho-primitivism is, well, you got to kill off 99% of the population to live this way. I mean, clearly we are built to be immediate return, or to be hunter-gatherers, at least. We're certainly built that way. Although, in the last, 6,000-7,000 years of evolution, maybe we're not as built. There's all kinds of people who are evolved not exactly to do hunting and gathering. That's another thing. Like if you have flat feet, you're not going to make a great hunter-gatherer. If there's that kind of stuff. So, and we're probably not as strong as they, but anyways,
totally.
But in general, so much of our bodies and our psychologies is based on a hunting and gathering lifestyle. And I think it's very important actually to focus. It's a bit dangerous, but it's also very important to focus a bit on biology and evolution.
Yes.
Like many people on the left or who think they're on the left are absolutely allergic to evolution and biology. Right. I know Graeber and Wengrow certainly did not want to ever talk about anything like that, because it's associated with racism and with the Nazism and all that stuff. So, and it very quickly goes there. Like if you look at all the people who are into evolutionary psychology, like 90%, 80% are like sexist kind of are into it in order to justify kind of weird sexist and racist stuff. But at the same time, it doesn't have to be. There are all kinds of radical left-wing evolutionary anthropology types. And we really need to and we all, and even the most, anti-evolution person who's afraid of talking about evolution in terms of personality, those people will not be afraid for 5 seconds to admit that, the reason we can eat unlimited amounts of sugar and fat and chips, and I drank, ate a whole bunch of Reese's Pieces peanut chocolate chips today that I regretted. Like the reason, we have those impulses, even though they're not good for us, is because that made sense in an environment where those resources were limited. So in a Tanzanian Hadza community, when they find some honeycomb, they eat 10,000 calories of honey and wax and bees in a day, and then they sleep for the whole day in a diabetes coma or whatever, and that's okay because it happens like once every 3 months, and it's not a big, not a big deal. But for us, you're doing that every day, and you're just on the road to killing yourself. Now, the same things apply to so many other things about us. So, for example, one of my theories about hierarchy is just like we crave unlimited amounts of sugar because no one was ever going to have unlimited amounts of sugar. We also might crave always a little bit more power and a little bit more wealth than we have, but because no one was ever going to get that much power or wealth. Like even in those, when I was talking about the Paleolithic squeeze and pull times, even in those squeeze times when you'd have maybe one person who had a bit more authority than others, there's only a bit more authority. They only got a bit more food than everybody else. They only got like in their wildest dreams, you weren't going to have anything like a rich person has today, like that disparity of zillions and obscene amounts of wealth that you wouldn't even know what to do with. Like if I took away 99% of Elon Musk's wealth, he wouldn't even notice besides the numbers on his computer. Like life wouldn't change in any way for his children, for generations. So that did not exist. And so we have maybe that insatiable. So what you need to do is create an environment. Now, we're built for that hunter-gatherer environment, maybe. I mean, in part, certainly, but to what extent, we don't know, because we might have evolved a bit since then. But we want to emulate the best parts of it, and in so far as much as we can without having to kill anybody. We don't want to kill off 99% of the population. So, what's the degree? Is like I don't know. It's like, maybe we do need a certain amount of hierarchy, but we have to orient ourselves to eliminating it insofar as possible. And that should be the orientation of society. The orientation of society should always, why is there no, I'm going to make a video on how socialism will solve all of Jordan Peterson's problems. And if you
yes,
if you look at if you look at Jordan Peterson, right, he's constantly, and the reason he's so famous, right, is one of the reasons he's so famous is he's constantly complaining about real problems.
Right.
You go on
Exactly.
dating apps and
yes.
well, the richest, good lookingest men and women will get 99% of the views, and note that the algorithm blocks out everybody else. So nobody else even gets a chance and all this stuff. And you have so many choices and everyone's going to try to catch the richest, most good looking person or whatever, or the youngest, most beautiful woman or whatever it is. Well, guess what? The solution to that is get rid of the profit motive from Tinder. Like it's that simple, Facebook is causing genocide. Facebook is causing 12-year-old girls to commit suicide. Guess what? Easy solution. Get rid of the profit motive and make it a democratic cooperative and watch that completely disappear in 5 seconds. So, there's of course the argument that, if you try to get rid of the profit motive, you have communism, you have the Soviet Union. That's wrong. And I could, I'm going to do an episode of why that's wrong.
Totally.
But even maybe that's true to a certain extent, but let's find out what that extent is. Why is there no commission on getting rid of the profit motive insofar as much as possible? Well, the reason is because the people who live by profit control everything. But the idea is that so, when you're talking about what's my political ideology, I hate using all those 19th century terms of socialist, anarchist, whatever. Yeah. But, for me is the orientation of trying to remove as much hierarchy as possible while still having a functional society. So, we don't know what that is because we haven't even tried. Like we've seen interesting experiments in anarchist Spain where the workers ran their own factories, the peasants ran their own agriculture, and they cooperated with each other and coordinated each other. It looks good to me. Who knows how if it didn't get crushed by the communists and the fascists, maybe that would have, worked out well, or maybe it would have collapsed. We don't know. But this is what we need to be going for and finding out the limits and how little hierarchy we can get away with. In some situations, like if you're directing a movie, you need hierarchy. I don't think you can have and hierarchy, of course, when talking about politics, is about decision making. We're not talking about so much about money, although money is decision making power, but politics is about decision making in groups. So when we're talking about political hierarchy, we're talking about decision making power. So in a cinema context, well, if the director can't tell, if the director tells the lighting person what to do and the lighting person's like, no, I don't want to do that. That looks stupid. I think we should have this kind of lighting. You can't function, right? If the craft table is saying no and the extras are saying, no, I want to do it like this, the movie's going to be a disaster. That doesn't work. So you need some kind of hierarchy. The director has to be able to command and people have to obey. But there's no reason why the producer or the investors get all the money and everybody else just gets a wage.
Exactly. Right? No, for real.
It could be a cooperative that everybody.
I used to work in the film industry, so this is a thought I had every day on set.
There you go. So you know exactly what I'm talking about, right?
Yes.
There's all kinds of unjust hierarchies.
Yes.
There's a hierarchy which I would say is just and necessary, inherent to the occupation of making a film. But then there's a dozen hierarchies in there which have no purpose, just to give the people who have money and power more money and power.
Totally.
Right. So you can have a democracy where people democratically choose to be obedient to the director for the purpose or creative purposes, and then have no obedience to the director once the film is over or when it comes to dividing up the profits of the movie.
Exactly.
So we should be doing this with everything, right?
And it's essentially like a hunting party. Problems. Right? Like when a hunting party goes out, like you're going to listen to the person who's really fucking good at hunting. You know what I mean? Like there's definitely like little scale of leadership. And that's the thing. Like the word hierarchy to me is maybe misleading in the way that we use it, or we project it onto certain things. Like, I wish that there was more diversity of language around explaining organizations other than, hierarchy and not hierarchy or whatever. Like, because there's some that are, where somebody's getting all of the resources. And then there's others that are just like decision-making that are voluntarily done because you understand like nobody's better than anybody else in terms of, what I'm saying? Yeah.
Well, that's exactly, what you brought up, the hunting party example is perfect. So if people don't know, even in those hyper-egalitarian societies where you have no chief, you have no leader, even parents, sometimes children have more authority than parents, because when it comes to something, we're making a decision for the future, the parents understand that the children are the one that are going to have to live in the future, not us. So the kids get more authority in those types of decisions, right? That's such an egalitarian society. But when it's time to go hunting, people choose often a hunting leader. And he tells people what to do and they do it. And these are egalitarian societies that are so egalitarian that when there's a conflict between two people, they can't choose a mediator among their own ethnic group because who's this big shot? Who does he think he is, or she think he is? She's making the choices. They have to get someone from the neighboring pastoralist tribe to come in and mediate for them, because it will disrupt their whole internal cohesion. So that's how egalitarian they are. But when they go hunting, they choose a hunting party leader, and they obey that hunting party leader. And as soon as the hunt is over, even during the hunt, they might say, no, I'm not doing this. Like, what are you telling, but when the hunt is over, the guy has no authority whatsoever unless people like him, right? So so I would call that a voluntary hierarchy or a democratic hierarchy versus a dominance hierarchy, right? Because hierarchy is, but those blend into each other. And I think we have to be watchful about that. But dominance hierarchy is about you are getting benefit. A dominance hierarchy is where the benefit is for the people at the top of the hierarchy. A democratic hierarchy is where the benefit of the hierarchy exists for the benefit of the people at the bottom of the hierarchy, or for all the people at the hierarchy. We have you as our leader. So you can see that in the, what do they call, Nambikwara, that Graeber talks about. Their chief is basically there because it's useful for the people, and it helps them in various ways. So you get to be chief because we need you as the chief. The second that we don't need you anymore, that you're like overstepping your bounds, see you later, we're going for this other chief. So the institution of a chief is there because it's necessary, but nobody has to. And those can easily, one can slip into the other very quickly. I think hierarchy is a bit like nuclear power or something. It's dangerous. Anyways, I don't know enough about nuclear. There's debate about whether nuclear power is necessary or not, but let's pretend it is sort of necessary in some situations. It might be necessary sometimes, but you have to be very, very careful with it, because it could destroy everything. And the hierarchy is like that. Even Jordan Peterson, he's so funny. Anyways, I find him fascinating, because it's a bit like David Graeber. His finger is in all the right places, but he just can never get to the right answer because his head is so full of garbage. Graeber was so full of weird, I don't know what, idealist garbage, and Peterson is he's got a conservative temperament. So he's always very afraid of change. And he's also probably traumatized by being yelled at by kids, so he can't, the whole idea of the left scares him, and he equates it with Stalinism. But, in university context, I could see what he's so afraid of. But
so you mentioned leveraging power. And I want to kind of like look at that in terms of, how do we get unstuck or whatever, right? Especially in a globally linked society where you have multiple hierarchies in competition with one another, with leveraging power over one another. Like, how do you get out of that cycle, right? Like, what's the,
so you mean like different, so are you mean to say, like, let's say the United States decided to become an anarcho-communist society, then we just be invaded by Russia or China or something like that?
Yeah, it's like a prisoner's dilemma or whatever, right?
So I don't know, obviously, the solution to that. There's different ways of dealing with that, where you could still have a military, for example, a militia, a universal service militia, dealing with the outside world, but have democracy and workers' rights at home. Obviously, and the socialists always understood this, or most of them, is that the idea, the Russians, before they did the Russian Revolution, understood that actually think they might have been wrong in a sense, but they didn't think that you could have socialism in one country. They thought that, we're going to do the revolution in Russia, and all of Europe is going to have a revolution shortly thereafter, because it really seemed like they were about to, and that's going to make socialism possible here. The idea of socialism in one country was just, no one thought that was possible until Stalin, for very selfish or practical reasons, decided to make that the official policy, because they were basically stuck. So, like, who knows, maybe a country like the United States is wealthy enough that they could pull off that socialism in one country thing. But then again, why are they so prosperous? Well, in a way, because they're exploiting all these other countries.
Exactly.
Look, I don't know, okay, but it could be, and I do believe this, that the conditions of today, and this is, one of the things I want to talk about when I consume my Graeber series, is that I think that the material conditions of today actually create opportunities for us to be egalitarian in ways that weren't possible 100 years ago, 200 years ago, 1,000 years ago, at least not on the scale that we're talking about, like for civilizations, I think. And we can see that and Graeber sort of mentioned this a bit in the book, which I thought was one of the brilliant parts of the book. Somebody today, if you go study like the Haudenosaunee people, or you go study one of the egalitarian hunter-gatherer societies, you'll relate to those people. Like, if you read one of those ethnographies, like, there's some things that have been going on there that you're going to find weird and you don't relate to, but most of it you're going to relate to way more than you're going to relate to 15th century Europeans, with all the weird things that they believe, and that they're the witchcraft and the punitive punishment, and how they love torture and murder and like all this crazy stuff, and their religious beliefs. because the material conditions have given us a lot of things that resemble hunter-gatherer immediate return societies, in the sense of like a welfare state, for example, creates conditions where people can move around more easily, and where people aren't stuck on there's that book, Why Sex is Better Under Socialism. So the idea is that no, this is a funnier example. That, this guy Rush B, he's this horrible pickup artist guy. he writes these books like Bang Sweden, Bang France. Like he write all these books on how to go have sex with girls, how to manipulate basically girls into having sex with you in every country as a tourist. Now he's some kind of weird traditional Catholic or Muslim. Wow. I forget what religion he is, but of course, because now that he's in his 40s and his testosterone's calming down, he's becoming this bitter old man. And he's all bitter about like, oh, women, I can't find a real girlfriend. All these women are so superficial. Gee, maybe it's because you're just chasing all these people with manipulation techniques. Anyway, sorry, I'm a rambler. The point is that he wrote a book called Don't Bang Denmark. And because when he went to Denmark, none of his tricks worked, because women there don't need a rich guy. They don't need a guy who's flashing his wealth. They don't need a dominant guy, because they have a great social welfare system. So they can live independently on their own. And if they get pregnant, they don't become these dependent people who need to better stick with this man than be on my own, which is a compromise that many people make and have made over the years. They don't have to make any of those compromises because they have such a generous welfare state. So they look for a good partner, someone who's going to raise their kids well, someone's going to treat them well, and someone who knows how to sexually please them well, which is what that book is, Sex is Better Under Socialism. They compared East Germany, whatever, all the problems with East Germany, there was still that welfare state. So women in East Germany were much more interested in a partner that knew how to do sex properly than in West Germany, where women were, even though West Germany was wealthier, there wasn't that same safety net. So women were much more interested in a man that was wealthy. And the amount of orgasms they had was much less in West Germany than in East Germany. It was this great experiment. Right, there's the same society at the beginning, and then 50 years later, the only difference is the like that welfare, that welfare state, and it changes completely the sexual. That's another example of materialism, by the way. It changes how good men are at sex, because they don't have to be in West Germany if they have money, whereas they have to be in East Germany to be a woman. So I forget why I'm even talking about this. Well, in a civilization. Sorry, can you repeat the question if you remember it?
Yeah, we're just riffing on this notion of if one culture, one nation state or whatever has more power, and they could just take over another one if it's trying to transition to something that is more social.
So because of the global economy, and this is a problem it's funny because the left used to talk about this a lot in the 90s, and then they just stopped talking about it. And I don't know if it's because something changed in the global economy that I don't know about, or because just the left is afraid to talk about it because it's depressing, is that if we want to do something in one country, we have to do it other places, because if not, the companies can say, well, we're just going to Vietnam, we're just going to, and then Vietnam gets more labor rights, and they're like, oh, we're going to Burma, or we're going to this, So to a certain extent, you need several, and this is what they're sort of trying to do a bit in Europe, like with the Varoufakis's DM25 movement, is you need not just one country, but you need a whole alliance of wealthy countries that can form a bloc enough to trade with each other, and if they're blockaded by the outside, that they could still be sustainable on some level, and you need, I think, solidarity between poor countries and rich countries, and you need it to be a more broad movement than just in one country. So that's I think a material constraint that is real and a bit daunting, but at the same time, I think today we hate the internet because we're just at the beginnings of it, right? Like, think, the biggest, the technology that changed the world the most versus anything was, I think there was some kind of 100 technology list, and it was the printing press. It changed everything. Like, the Enlightenment happened, Protestantism happened, like, you had a sort of stable system for 1,000 years, and this printing press happens, and everything changes very rapidly. Because people are able to communicate, it pushes us towards democracy, it pushes us towards all this stuff. So the internet is like the new printing press. It's like creating this other level of communication and democracy, even though right now it just seems like insanity. And, because all these algorithms are just pushing teenage girls to commit suicide and making genocide in Burma and all this insane, and making your grandparents, and believe insane QAnon conspiracies and stuff like that. But I think we're just at the beginnings of it. I think there's so much potential. Like if you look at why did Haiti have a successful, whatever, it turned into something bad, but why did they have a successful revolution against colonial France? And why did slave rebellions in the US almost always fail and never go anywhere? Well, the difference is that, there's a bunch of differences, but in Haiti, the slaves were as abused as they were during the day. They were kind of free to do their own thing at night. And they would go on they'd have these dancing events and religious events, but it was a network that spanned across the entire island. So they're able to communicate. People on one side of the island were able to communicate with people on the other side of the island, and people are able to report back on what the colonials were doing and stuff like that. So they were able to organize and orchestrate and successfully carry out a revolution because they had communication. Whereas in the United States, you basically didn't have any social network if you're a slave outside of your master's home, right? So you might, if you had a big home, you might have 20, 30 other people, but it just, so those rebellions were just like, they kill the master, they kill a couple of people, and then they get shot and killed by the authorities. There's nothing, they just couldn't, they just weren't capable, another materialist explanation, right?
Yeah.
So we had this internet, as terrible and idiotic as it is right now, I think once we learn how to use it more intelligently, and I think, if young people just don't end up just, dying in complete isolation with no friends, I think people more and more, like I've noticed the way people my age consume media at first is like using way too much internet, being way too addicted to their screens, and then sort of just being like, oh, you know what? I don't need to go on Facebook. I don't need to do Instagram. I'm going to use it once in a while just to see how my friends are doing, or to see if I'm invited to a wedding or something.
Yeah.
And I think younger people who are growing up with this stuff are going to figure out, even though it's all poisoned by profit motive and stuff, they'll still sort of might figure out how to use it better, and then we can actually use it for good purposes and to organize things. And I think people don't realize like just how much potential there is to Arnold Schroeder, who's a guy who hosts Fight Like an Animal podcast, and I had him on my show. He was talking about how in Standing Rock that there was all these these protests, and the protests got so big that they had to call police departments from like 12 adjoining counties, and state troopers. So to come into all this one area. And it was just I don't know how many people were protesting at Standing Rock, but it's not that big relative to the population of the country. But you had to have 12 areas that had no police or protection, state enforcement services almost whatsoever, because they're all, dealing with this relatively small protest. So imagine if you actually had a movement that involved 1 million people, 2 million, like that Occupy. That's one reason also that I was like shitting on Graeber so much, is that Occupy had an enormous amount of potential.
Totally.
You don't have to be violent to have all this potential. Totally. You just have to, the state can't get away. I mean, it can sometimes, but you can't just shoot people anymore the way you could, even 50 years ago. It's much harder to use violence because we have all this media exposure. Totally. People get very upset very quickly. Look at the George Floyd protests, right? Whether you all for them or you think it was a bunch of chaos, it doesn't matter. The fact is that you had these cities up in arms doing
all
a lot
over the world.
All over the world, right? And no one, I mean, if that happened, first of all, if they were happening in cities, if that happened 50 years ago, you'd been shooting down a lot of these people, right? If it happened if somebody else was president at the time, or if somebody was mayor, I mean, because cities tend to be democratic, but you can imagine a Republican mayor not tolerating that and shooting down a bunch of people. Yeah. But the idea is that nowadays, it's much harder to just mow down a bunch of people because you have social media, you have access to information, you have all this alternative media that you didn't have before. So people would know about it and people would be up in arms. So you had...
So, I mean, there's a couple of like other premises I feel that kind of are resting in this too, which is that on some level, there's a time limit to this, right? Like the climate collapse is imminent. Yes.
I think, yes.
Yeah. I mean, the oceans are acidifying faster than the climate is collapsing. So there won't be seafood by the year 2047, according to NASA.
Yeah.
So, there's this time limit of like, and I think there's a thing where people tend to lose hope when they get overwhelmed by
Yeah.
the broadness or the, you know, all of the things that we're talking about, right? But I feel like there's a level of when the society loses its or starts to, you know, hit the point of diminishing returns, and it no longer has that amount of energy coming in to maintain a level of violence that it was using, then you start to see transition happening. And I feel like the internet will become super power. And I mean, I tend to be one of those people that's like, I don't think anything's going to happen until we hit that point of diminishing returns. And but I'm also trying to constantly grapple with that. Like, what can we do now? Even if that could be beneficial either way, right? Like, that's kind of one of the things I think about. But I also just wanted to mention Mastodon really quick, because it's funny to think about how Twitter is collapsing right now. And Mastodon is this decentralized version. It's not like exactly like Twitter, but it's essentially a similar type service that's considered like a federation. It's not corporately controlled. It's very different. And people are migrating over to that. And I was having this conversation with a friend of mine the other day where I was like, now that like people like are moving over to Mastodon because of Elon Musk, what's really going to push Mastodon to be the forefront of a lot more change is another type of event like the George Floyd uprising, where people are going to need to use that form of communication much more on a global. I mean, people are already using it, right?
Because the corporate one won't let you talk about like like right now they're censoring mostly stupid stuff, although they also censor good stuff. But they're gonna, you know, that censorship stuff is horrible because they're just gonna censor political good stuff.
Yes,
very quick at the blink of an eye.
They're already doing it.
They're already doing it. But they'll like really.
Elon Musk has been like banning all of the Antifa and anti-fascist accounts. In fact, he even just banned Crime Think like 2 days ago.
See, that doesn't surprise me at one point or another. I mean, because the whole idea that it's owned by a centralized corporate organization, whether they're a government organization or central, like as soon as it brushes up against their interests, they're like, okay, we're going to shut all this down. Like, but is this Mastodon? Because I'm always asking people, like, is there some alternative to YouTube, for example?
Right.
And everyone keeps sending me this stuff, but it's always another for-profit company. And I'm like, first of all, it doesn't have the reach of YouTube, but it's a for-profit company. So like in 5 and 10 years, if it ever gets anywhere, it's just going to turn to garbage because that's all these companies, you know, YouTube was great 10 years ago. Now it's garbage. Google was great 10 years ago. Now it's garbage because this publicly traded corporations, it's how that's what happens to them. So is Mastodon a non-profit cooperative organization?
I would look into
how does it work?
I would look into it more. I'm not fully, I don't use the internet on that scale. Mostly I used Twitter to follow live news here in Portland when the uprisings were going on, so I could know where to go or whatever, you know, like there were certain benefits to having it. I never used it. I barely ever post on it, but Mastodon is kind of in a similar thing, except the thing about Mastodon is it's like, anybody can create their own server it's sort of like a decentralized, I don't know if the company itself is privately owned.
Company, exactly. Company. See,
right, exactly.
It's a bit like Bitcoin and stuff where there's this decentralized aspect, but there's also this centralized control aspect where I'm just But actually, it's good that you brought this up. Like, I don't know anything about Mastodon one or the other, right? And I just learned about it this second. I think someone mentioned it yesterday on Twitter, and I was like, oh, what's that? I don't care. But what you're saying is very important, because one of the things that so what can we do now, right? And look, the Earth. It's funny. I just heard the Lex Fridman podcast, and he just had a couple of like climate people on, and they're both like middle of the road climate people saying, oh, we don't, things are definitely getting worse, but we don't have to worry. We're not all going to die in the next 30 years. Okay, I don't know. You know what I mean? Maybe those guys are right. Maybe that's garbage.
100%.
Maybe I have no. I have not because it's a scary topic. I haven't investigated. Like Arnold Schroeder. Like, he tells me like, well, unless we invent some new technology, civilization is basically going to be destroyed in the next, I don't know what he said, 100 years, 50 years. But then there's these other people are saying, no, civilization is not going to be destroyed, but we're going to have some problems that we have to deal with. I don't know which of those extremes are true. I don't know. I have no idea. But what I do know is that what I think is a very important, like everybody's got to apply themselves. One of the things that you need to do is just do something, okay? Because we don't do anything. And it's also, that people, I read a statistic that I don't know if it's a quarter of people or a quarter of people under a certain age have literally no friends, which is brutal. People are very isolated nowadays. And we don't know how to connect to other people. This is worse with younger people. So one of the things one of the ways you can connect with people is by joining an organization and love like-minded people and doing something. There's a ton of problems. It's much more fun to join an organization with your friends or start an organization, because you might not like the culture of the organizations and their cliquish and all these problems. But anyways, get involved in something, even volunteering in something, whatever you're doing. But one of the things that I think, I can do, and that is important, is spreading certain kinds of ideas, because it's all about common sense. What's in the common sense? What's in the air? So I think that you're right in that there's some kind of catalyzing event that will precipitate the desire for change. And I think the material conditions are such that change can actually happen quite quickly. Totally. I think Occupy, I think it's people don't realize just how easily things can change. It could be a wonderful change or it could be a terrible change. I think Occupy Wall Street had enormous potential to change things. I don't think the government with all their nukes and things can just kill everyone. I don't think that's going to happen for a whole number of reasons. I think you could have a very quick change. But the problem is, if nobody has any idea, if the ideas in the air are stupid ideas, the change is going to be bad.
Exactly.
Or the change is going to be done. Like Occupy, they had this idiotic idea of don't make any, maybe you believe in this idea, I don't know, but don't make any demands idea. It's, that whole idea was, to me, the suicidal insanity where I think they had a potential to maybe get one, I talked about it on my show, and there's an article, an academic article about it, about how in Occupy New York, there were people who wanted to make one demand. Let's push one demand in unison. And either we have such influence, and because it was overwhelmingly popular, it was so popular that the state wouldn't clear out these people from all these parks, just like the George Floyd protests. You had all these people doing illegal stuff, and the state with all their guns and tanks is just sitting there picking their noses because everyone is on their side. They changed the whole vocabulary of the nation.
Totally.
So these people are like, let's push one demand, and they had like, let's end corporate personhood, or let's I forget what. Oh, there was one that was good, like so obvious.
Tax the rich or something.
Get money out. Get money out of politics. That's the one. I think that would have been the winner. That's something that and this, when you have people supposedly on the left or the right, that's one of the reasons I started my podcast, because people agree on 80% of things. You could have the most racist person and then the most, super egalitarian PC person. But when it comes to socialized medicine, a lot of those people are on the same page and they can and should cooperate on that. But they're divided by, I'm going to vote for Donald Trump because I want free healthcare. That, that's in the air. So there are these people who want to push that one demand, and getting money out of politics has 96% support. Do you know that more Republicans want monopolies to be broken up than Democrats? Like that's something that's, you can do something with that. There's such power in that if you just get those people together instead of that idiotic dividing line between this stupid corporate party and that stupid corporate party. Anyway, so a big section of Occupy wanted to push one demand, and the best demand, I think, was get money out of politics. And there was they had rules that you had to have a 75% vote in order to pass resolutions. So they had beyond 75% to pass these resolutions, but then the people in charge of making the rules changed it to 90% because they were dedicated, and Graeber was one of those people, on not having any demands. We're just going to sit here masturbating because somehow that's, and they had their idea. The point is, you push this demand, and then everyone, the entire country, 96% Republicans and Democrats are on your side. And either you might actually get something done, you might actually get concessions out of the government. And if you get probably some half-assed concessions, but if you do, you taste blood and you realize, we can get more if we just do this again. And it would create a precedent of anytime we're really upset and there's a giant consensus on something, 96%, let's have an Occupy movement and then get stuff done. Or the police comes in and they close it down. They're probably not going to shoot. I mean, they might shoot some people, but they'll probably close it down violently. And then people realize, like, wow, this is something that everybody agrees on, but the government put in the guns and the tank and the dogs instead of doing it. So that's also a catalyzing moment. So it's like a win-win situation either way. But instead, they're like, no, let us jerk each other off in this circle and just do nothing. I mean, it's not they didn't do anything, but like, let's just collapse until the public gets bored of us, because the public's like, I guess they're not doing anything. And then they get bored, and then they put in the dogs and they close the thing down. And the reason Occupy did reverberate in a lot of ways, but it was a whimper compared to what it could have been because of the stupid organization. So that's because our society is full of garbage ideas. And the other garbage ideas that we have is this weird half-baked right-wing libertarian stuff. Like the popular ideas are this weird mix of social democracy, right-wing libertarianism, weird right-wing cultural issues, and this dumb, on the left we have all this dumb, like, don't do anything decentralism. Right. I mean, I'm for decentralism, but it has to be effective, right? So there's just, everything is idiotic. So for me,
tell me what you really think.
yeah, I could go on. I'm holding back actually, but I could. I'm trying to clean up let's understand what left and right means. Let's understand what socialism means. Let's understand what this means, what that means, whether you agree with it, whether you like it or not, whether you like my definitions or not. Let's just think about how words are used, how they're used to manipulate us, how we actually agree with a lot of people that we are on different sides of some dividing line, and how we can unite with those people to achieve things and get good ideas in the air. Let's show that, get rid of the profit motive. That's a terrible, Twitter sucks because of profit. Facebook sucks because of profit. Tinder sucks because of profit. Healthcare sucks because of profit. Like, let's put those ideas, make those ideas common sense, so that when there is, and also make the idea of don't sit around masturbating. That's not anarchism. That's just masturbating. That's academic, upper middle class, rich kid stuff. So that when the next crisis happens, whether it's a police shooting or whether it's a climate event or whether it's who knows what, we have no idea. No one expected Occupy to happen. Some nonsense, some meshugas, who knows what it's going to be. That it's not a bunch of people like, let's vote for Adolf Hitler because maybe he'll do something different, which is like what Donald Trump to me is, right? People are just like, and I know a lot of, Hispanic people, a lot of people are just like, well, he looks like he's going to do something different. He sets the alarm bells off in me and you for various reasons. But there's other people who doesn't, my dad, it doesn't send off alarm bells to my dad. My dad knows he's kind of stupid and he's a bit of a thug, but he's like, well, sometimes we need a guy like that to shake things up. Right. But so you want those people who think like that to be able to see through the Donald Trumps and to be able to see through the bullshit and see through the Democrats and see through the Republicans and have common sense. Like the idea that profit is ruining everything could be a common sense idea easily. I think the idea that people could run their own workplace should be a common sense idea easily. I think the idea that the environment is being destroyed and corporations are destroying the environment is already a common sense idea. It's just that nobody knows what to do about it. But that's for me what I think I can do, and that's what I'm doing right now. And I think awesome. That's something I don't think everyone should be doing that, because everyone needs to. There's other things that need to be done too besides that. So and one thing that can be easily done, like if you have computer skills, start your cooperative Facebook, start your cooperative Twitter, like, because those are great ideas. Like, give the kudos to the whoever, I don't think it was Elon, whoever started Twitter. Usually the guys who run the corporation stole it from some other guy. And the most horrible piece of shit rises to the top. But whoever thought of that, whether Jeff Bezos thought of Amazon, these are in some ways great services. Uber, Airbnb. Like, I spend my life fighting Airbnb because they're destroying housing and causing rents to explode. And, but you can put, anyways, we successfully lobbied to limit Airbnbs in my city. So I feel proud of some work that we did there. But all these things you could easily, like, we could get rid of rent evictions, and you can get rid of a huge rent eviction problem by just getting rid of Airbnb and making a new law that says in order to rent out something on a platform like Airbnb, you have to live in the actual apartment. That would, just giant change with a little flick of a switch. Or just get rid of Airbnb, make Airbnb a cooperative organization, make Uber a workers cooperative, so that the taxi drivers benefit from Uber and the customers benefit from Uber, and get rid of that stupid medallion system that's been enslaving taxi drivers, but also get rid of the stupid Uber system that's enslaving Uber drivers. Like, these simple things. So if you're a software developer, and instead of just making a $1 zillion company that's going to become another mega slave owning company, think of how to make a decentralized worker control, like Wikipedia, whatever. It has a lot of problems, but it's actually a very good source of information. And it's a decentralized, well, it's not completely decentralized. It has like a central thing, but it's, if you want to get involved, you can get involved. You do have a say. It's a democratic organization. That's a good model. It's not going to solve all of society's problems, but all these terrible fucking apps that are just making everybody commit suicide can be turned around completely. It's just terrible. Like the young, I forget, is it young women, young girls like age 12 to 16 or something? Their suicide rate doubled since 2010. and it has everything to do with cell phone access and social media access. So, and Facebook actually had they realized this, and they had a project to change it. And then they're like, well, this is going to cause 1% drop in our profits. So I guess we can't do that. Too bad. Like that's easy to, and it's not hard. Like if you're talking about the word anarchism, that's going to scare away a lot of people. You talk about the word communism, that's going to scare away a lot of people. But just getting rid of that stupid crap is really easy, that everyone can agree on. We don't need to,
exactly.
There's a lot of things that, workers should have a say in their workplaces. Why doesn't democracy apply to the workplace? Of course, that'll have some resistance, but a lot of people would find that very interesting, but they've never heard it before. So there's a lot of simple things that we can, messages that we can get out there. And I think that the material conditions, I don't know, like maybe have people telling me civilization is impossible to maintain because of this just inherently so destructive. I have no idea. Okay. So obviously you need to deal with that material reality, but the material realities of communication, of the amount of production that you can have, which I'm sure you have to reduce on some level to not make it destroy everything, and internet and all that stuff, you can, social safety nets, you can recreate in an effective, the conditions that made hunter-gatherer people, that make hunter-gatherer people so free and equal. You can approximate those in a civilizational context. It's already been happening since the welfare state. You can see that our attitudes on marriage. Why don't we have tribes anymore? I mean, part of that is the church and European history, but part of that is, a lot of that has to do with the welfare state, with the fact that you don't have these, the tribes exist as a means of controlling property. We don't have that same need to control that property. The capitalism has broken up that whole thing. So it in some ways, it's like Marx talked about capitalism, creative destruction. So in some ways it destroyed old things and makes possible new things. And we can see that the welfare state is like this embryonic, not that the state should be necessarily the means for it, but anyways, I feel like I'm talking too much abstraction, but
it's cool.
The material conditions are there, I think.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think there's definitely a lot that we can all do.
We can talk to people in Vietnam and third world countries, and now people have, people in Vietnam have internet. I see cool Vietnamese internet channels. You can communicate with those people. You can create alliances and have an international movement in ways that weren't possible, before.
So if people were gonna jump into your channel, do you feel like you've done it in a sequential way where they should start at the beginning?
I mean, if you're really into anthropology and the rewilding stuff that you're talking, that you guys who listen to this are into, then you probably want to start on my political anthropology episodes where I talk directly about that, So start with like the ones that 6 or 7, hierarchy, inequality, where male dominance comes from, why you can't eliminate sexism just by eliminating sexism. Those are good ones, or the David Graeber stuff, if you're interested in that book. And then once you go to that, then you can go to what's the right and left, and how do we know what right and left means, or why is it important? Why should we care? What does politics mean? What does, all these words, what do they mean? And how dangerous is it that we don't know what if you think about any political term, the word politics, the word the market, the word government, the word left and right, nobody knows what any of these words mean, really. We sort of feel what they mean. I was studying politics for 20 years. And then when I sat down to write left and right, I realized I did not know what these ABC words meant. And then when I read a bunch of literature, I realized that people with PhDs in poli-sci don't know what these words mean. So what does that do to us? It makes us very easy to manipulate, So
totally. Awesome.
So,
I mean, not awesome,
anyways.
But awesome that you're creating, a language around it for people to better understand. I feel like I want to keep talking to you about, loads more things, but we're out of time. Is there like one last thing that you want to say before we go, or?
I can't think of anything right now. I'm sure there's a bazillion things, but
yeah,
we can talk another time, whatever you want.
Awesome.
It's too bad.
How many more videos do you have lined up for the dawn of everything? Like how many more are you going to do for that?
So I did chapters 1 to 3, which took 5 or something episodes and 9 months to produce. I'm going to do up till chapter 5. I'm going to do chapter 4 and 5. And then I'm going to talk about probably another episode about the rest. It might be 1 or 2 episodes to deal with the rest, because I have enough expertise, or whatever you call it, to talk in depth about chapters 1 to 5. And after that, I don't have enough knowledge.
Mm.
And there's Walter Scheidel wrote a wonderful review where he really covers chapter 6 to the end brilliantly. So
Awesome.
I don't need to, someone else did it. I don't need to do it, you know? But I'm going to go over it and a bit talk about prospects for the future, some of the stuff we talked about here. So cool. I'd say, I don't know, 3 to 5 more episodes. I'm taking a little break now. I'm doing awesome. a little stuff about communism in Russia, and Jordan, you know, changed my brain a little bit, but I'm going to get back to it for sure.
Cool. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming on. Looking forward to the rest of your videos. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Rewilding Podcast. Check out the show notes to connect with my guest and for a list of resources that we mentioned in our conversation. If this episode inspired you, made you think more deeply, or gave you some new tools to use, make sure to subscribe, share on social media, and become a patron at patreon.com/Peter Michael Bauer. Thanks.